Hi, everybody. So this week you read the book Amy Simpson by Troubled Minds. Wow. So this week, it's going to be a long semester. Okay, so Amy Simpson's Troubled Minds. This was a very simple introduction to the issue of mental health in the church in an attempt to orient us to some of the church's issues involved in caring for those who suffer mental illness and their families. Now, it would be a great book for you to use in your congregation to start a discussion about mental health in the congregation. It's a good church book, nice and simple, good for groups, social action ministry or Stephen ministry, pastoral care team. This book would be good for all of those contexts. It's based on the author's own experience of her mother who suffers from schizophrenia and her family's relation to the church. She also adds stories of others who have suffered from mental health conditions and pastors who struggle to know how to serve them. And it's really easy from the outside to think, oh, I would know how to respond, and I indeed would be the pastor of great compassion and grace. But in reality, we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Good to remember. So together, when we gather, we'll talk about what you think the church should do in light of her observations. And I'm going to offer a little bit of the problems she lays out, and then talk about John Swinton's idea of friendship. The issues that she talks about in Troubled Minds, as you know, are Christian shame, the stigma, pretending that everything was fine, the presence of unpredictable or unacceptable behavior, and how it is troubling or embarrassing, the chronic nature of mental illness, the uncertainty it brings to families and friends alike. The sense she got in church that no mess was allowed, that Christians don't suffer, or the spiritualization of the problem, but also questions like, are the mentally ill accountable for their sins? Is demon possession? Is it illness as punishment? So she talks about the dangers that uninformed clergy can do, and also even the condemnation that they can sometimes give, and that sometimes silence can be the worst condemnation. Another problem was confusing mental health with recovery ministries like Celebrate Recovery, and assuming that people with mental illness can join these recovery groups. Don't do that. Okay. So she presents some larger problems the church has, including a mistrust of psychology, but also the idea that pastors desire to present sort of a face of growth and success. And so the mentally ill are really the wrong kinds of people to have in church. They cause social disruption. They are not normative. And if our churches are about appearing successful, certainly they are not a sign of success. Indeed, perhaps they might drive away some of those families and parishioners that we are seeking to attract in our church. So do we need to change our church culture? And how might we imagine that? So John Swinton offers a framework for this work. He's quite a famous pastoral and practical theologian who writes on mental health and disability in the church. And he suggests that we understand the work of the church and mental issues through the category of friendship. This is about restoring personhood and dignity to the individual, as opposed to seeing them as a problem to be solved, as opposed to objectifying them. And for this, he uses that famous passage from John. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. And what is the context of this love? I do not call you servants any longer, but I have called you friends. So this is the context within which we receive the Great Commission. So friendship is a counterbalance to the types of positivistic and medicalized approaches to mental health conditions, where life can get back on normative track with the right medicine, or personhood can be restored once we have addressed or overcome the condition. So notice that, because this is very important, and it's a problem that we can have when we address many issues in church ministry, is the idea that we have a narrative of restoration, that we understand illness of all kinds as a detour from the normative path, not something that is expected, not something that is a part of life, but instead something that is separate from life, that needs to be dealt with by a medical intervention so we can get back on path of that progress, so that we want to get back on track. Our personhood can be restored, and we can imagine this is an aberration to God's plan for us. So friendship encourages us to move beyond pathology and begin to explore those aspects of people with mental health problems that fall outside the boundaries of the medical model of care. That there might be more to a person than solving this problem, and that indeed spiritual, emotional, personal growth can still take place within this problem, or maybe indeed in relation to this problem. So for Swinton, friendship is not a sentimental term. A concentration on friendship, he says, enables us to ask critical questions that are not on the agenda of those whose horizons are bound by the medical dictates of psychiatry, or from a focus primarily on pathology. Such friendships are both centripetal and centrifugal. They reach inward to the building of a loving and inclusive community, and outward to embrace and stand in solidarity with those who are oppressed and forced to the margins of society. If this is true, if those with mental health problems are among the poorest and most marginalized within society, then it becomes clear that friendship with those who suffer is not an option for the church. It is a requirement. It is a primary mark of identity and faithfulness from the one who called us to love, who laid down his life for us and called us his friend. So this means that we do not love because of any attribute possessed by the other, either good or bad, but because we are called to love like Christ. So it is a principle and not an emotion. The motivation for love does not come from anything about the other, whether they move us to love or anger or pity. The motivation to love or to practice love is motivated by the commandment and the sacrifice of Jesus. This is something that Bonhoeffer also talks about in Life Together, about how my love for the other can really be about my need for the other. But instead, in some ways, Jesus Christ is always between us. Jesus Christ is always the mediating salvation, grace, and commitment between us in community. For Swinton, a concentration on friendship allows one to explore issues of human relationships, personhood, spirituality, value, and community, all which can be easily overlooked or secondary if we just consider people with mental health issues as a problem. But there are some difficulties with this term. Do you notice? Friendship is a freighted term as well, isn't it? I am friends with who? I am friends with those I like. I am friends also with those who give back something to me. But Swinton claims that his analogy of friendship is not about the motivation for why friendship happens. For instance, a meeting of equals, a pragmatic alliance, a connection of interests. Instead, for him, the category of friendship reorients us to person-to-person encounter. So think about a close friend of yours, why you appreciate them, why they're important to you. They are human to you. They are a person beyond what they can do for you. They're people who unfold over time as you get to know them. So that's his argument for the term. But still, friendship cannot be used without some caution. You might think that I'm saying we should be emotionally close with everyone and not set professional boundaries, or that we should further insult the individual by suggesting that we have decided they are our friend right? When they have not asked or wanted to be our friend. Mhm. And the idea of being a friend can sound sentimental. I am your friend because it makes me feel good about being so friendly towards you who are aberrant. We have to be careful about our conscious and unconscious motivations when we use a term of relationship like friend. But it's just wise to offer more than one analogy in our preaching and in our teaching so that we counter the ways an analogy can turn against us. Avenues for this work are not surprising. Education, helping people reframe theologically and socially the stigmas of these conditions, and genuine encounters with people who suffer mental health conditions. And it's also important then to advocate in the community, especially for those who lack basic survival needs. There is no part in this process for sentimentalizing suffering or sentimentalizing the experience of those who suffer mental health conditions. If it is empowering for an individual to tell their story or to give testimony of their life experience, it can be a wonderful benefit to church culture, a wonderful blessing. But creating a space where people can tell their stories requires education. It requires creating an atmosphere where it is not strange for the concerns and especially the bodies of those who suffer to be present in worship or at community events, right? So you can't trot the abject in to give testimony or tell their story and then trot them back out again and then reflect on how wonderful and brave or whatever they are. No, the bodies of those who suffer mental health conditions, the bodies of the oppressed must be comfortable in our church cultures. And that means our church cultures must change. So part of that changing when we're talking about the silence about suffering in church communities is that it is not only the abject who get to stand and give their testimony and not people dressed in their Sunday best who do not give those kinds of testimonies. But indeed we discover if we work on cultivating a culture of honesty about suffering, that those dressed in their Sunday best are also the ones who suffer and suffer mental health conditions. So in all of these ways, there's a longer process of cultural change where the whole community grows in education, awareness, and theological understanding. So when we are thinking about what it means to be mentally ill or mentally healthy, think instead perhaps about domains of growth that will be different for different people. So when we're thinking about a bit more of a complex personhood rather than just an illness experience, if we think about the whole person, then we can think about a complex process of psychosocial and spiritual development. So then we're asking the question about whether or not a person has a capacity for growth, which sometimes requires a capacity for insight, or at least from learning from experience, or some kind of reflection on experience. Does a person have adequate sources of meaning and hope for the future? These do not have to look like what we consider meaning and hope for the future. Does a person have a sense of empowerment? Sometimes empowerment is in the small things. Is there an ability to accept challenges and to grow in the midst of them? Some of the most normatively successful people in the world are not actually able to grow in the midst of their challenges. Resources to ensure the possibility of sustaining healthy interpersonal relations with self, God, and others. We can really help with that. And an experience of feeling that there are possibilities for the future. So a sense of optimism, which usually goes with a sense of agency of some kind. So when we're thinking of this list of mental health domains, We're thinking more in terms of our capacity to relate to others, to relate to self, and to relate to the possibilities of our lives in terms of our future, our sense of empowerment, our sense of agency over our lives. So, in all of these ways, the church can be extremely helpful. Not only are we a place where people can find relationships, they can find care, they can practice relationships and sometimes fail, and yet find that they can return and learn from those failures. Everybody in church does that, not just people who have some kind of diagnosis, right? But also we find in church, hopefully, resources for meaning making, stories that are resonant and deep in our faith traditions, rituals that are empowering and resonating for us. We also have this opportunity as pastoral care providers to reflect back the strengths and the beauty that we see in people, to help them plan or problem solve in ways that give them a sense of hope for the future and a sense that they have some agency or empowerment over their lives. That won't always look the way that we think it should look. And the question is, how is it experienced by them? How is their agency experienced and their empowerment experienced by them? So because churches are places of relationship, places we hope of friendship, and places also where we situate those friendships and those relationships within the broader narrative of our Christian faith, as well as our hope for God's grace and salvation and connection to us in our needs, as well as in our joys. So in this place where our relationship with God and relationship with others makes that cruciform shape that can change us for all of us, and not just those who have diagnoses. It already is a long day. All right. So when we think about our mental health more broadly or more holistically, not in terms of pathology, but in terms of these categories that are suggested by Swinton, that it's about our relationship to self, to other, to our environment, to our sense of agency, and that those are experienced by believers in terms of their relationship with God and their relationship with the body of Christ, which is the community gathered. And that in that more complex picture of mental health, we might be learning and growing in some areas, doing less well in others, but in all areas there are potential for growth, regardless of what anybody's condition might be labeled. So in this more holistic model, then, we have this sense that perhaps there's something transformative about suffering, and that leads us to some questions about how we imagine that. So just very briefly, Anastasia Skirton offers an article about depression. She also has quite a few articles and some books that I would commend to you. And in the small article, she offers 3 major themes in theological thought about mental health conditions. So I will share them with you on the screen now for your edification. The first is spiritual illness, SI, in which depression and other forms of mental illness are believed to be caused by sin or demons or both. And so this is a theology trying to figure out what the cause is. So finding meaning in attributing mental illness to spiritual causes. Now, that can sound problematic to us, but indeed for some people, a spiritual illness kind of theology at least gives a sense of reason behind the sickness. And sometimes when we get a sense of reason behind the sickness, we feel empowered to address it. But it's not, it's not my favorite. Now, the spiritual health model, depression is viewed as an indication of and means to furthering holiness or closeness with God. And here, a condition of mental illness can be viewed as good. and actually something that it might be given to us by God as a kind of a suffering that transforms us. So this spiritual health theology sees instances of mental distress as supernatural and positive. They're caused by God. They're directed towards a person's salvation or sanctification. They're even a sign of their closeness to God. So when you think about the Catholic tradition, mystical theology, you're thinking about those who are moving towards the union of God, almost always having a moment of dark night of the soul. A moment when they know, which is the title of a famous book, by the way, that they do not experience closeness with God. They feel abandoned by God. In fact, Mother Teresa is probably the most contemporary sainted figure whose journals evince this kind of night of the soul. And so the idea is that in the process of purgation or purification of the soul, it goes through times of mental and emotional distress. Now, some advantage to spiritual health theology is it can help sufferers to make sense of their experiences and to find aspects of them transforming. The difficulty, of course, comes when we imagine that God kind of meets certain sufferings upon us so that we can grow or learn something from them. So that is a common idea in suffering. And, sometimes that can help people get through the moment of difficulty. But we also know that in general, when there's a whole culture or community that believes God does these things to us, sometimes it can also disempower us if our suffering is indeed caused by unjust social structures or experiences of abuse as well. So I have to be careful about these theologies, even as we respect that people find them useful to survive their lives in some way. Now, a potentially transformative model kind of seeks a middle way through this, where depression and many other instances of suffering as well are still considered bad. They're considered undesirable. And not in God's plan for us, and part of the fall, and part of the evil of the world. But yet at the same time, as we respond to them, they can become an occasion for a person's spiritual growth. This might be a little bit more about what Swinton is about. So in a potentially transformative theology, the idea is that depression, while it is negative, can indeed in many aspects of our lives, help us to spiritual and psychological maturity. A probably main idea would be like the wounded healer kind of figure. That woundedness somehow provides characteristics necessary for healing others. Although that is a little bit questionable, but it's a popular idea. So in the potentially transformative model, we don't think about necessarily the redemptive power of the suffering itself, and more its redemptive potential. So the power is not innate in what is happening, but it is a potential in how we respond to it. And so one is distinguishing between looking for the good in suffering as opposed to affirming that a condition is good or is from God. So that last point is important to emphasize, that that we're not thinking here about causation on that third potentially transformative model, but still we have to do something with what is before us. Well, none of us are immune to the changes and chances of this life, and so what indeed do we do with our suffering? It is not inevitably one thing that we can do. It is not inevitably one way that we respond to it. So suffering can be used for transformation without claiming that it is necessary for growth or claiming that it is just. We can grow through our suffering while still resisting the systems of oppression that keep that suffering in place. We can still resist individuals who abuse us, and yet as we experience any kind of lived experience, how does how does the lived experience of our lives interact with our sense of self, others, our environment, God, and the church?